I am delighted to be moderating this last panel, and it's perfect that you guys are these young, amazing social innovators running this incredible day, and people have had there's been such good feedback. So today we are talking about futures, and I'm going to introduce the panel, and I will read you these, and then you'll be like, okay, the future is in good hands. We can all leave now, because these people are amazing, total powerhouses. So just give me a moment here while I gather my notes. I'm going to first introduce Linh. Nguyen.
Good, that's good.
Thank you. She was like, I asked her how to pronounce her last name, and she said, you're going to screw it up tomorrow. Put my glasses back on. All right. I'm not going to say it again. You're just Linh from now on.
Okay, that's cool.
All right. Linh understands the power of the human-centered design process and its necessity in all realms of education, business, and policy. She is the founder of the Bodhi Collective. So the Bodhi Collective did that fabulous cloud in the other room, painstakingly put together with origami. It's an interdisciplinary group believing people and place are infinitely related. By using physical space as an agent for change, their philosophy intersects positive psychology, behavioral economics, and socially sustainable practices. Linh is a total dynamo, a total powerhouse. If you get a chance to talk to her, please do. I noticed that in two different parts of my script, one said she was a Ryerson grad, and one said she was a Ryerson student. And so I was like, what's the deal?
You can explain it.
And she said, oh, well, I dropped out so I could do this. So that's not entirely true. Yeah. Linh is a graduate, and she is doing a hiatus so that she can focus on her passion, which is the Bodhi Collective. So that's really interesting as well. Next, Vanessa Timmer. So Vanessa Timmer is the executive director of One Earth, a Vancouver-based think and do tank focused on sustainable consumption and production. One Earth is curating the new economics theme of Cities for People, initiated by the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, a Canada-wide experiment in advancing a movement to create more resilient and livable cities through innovation networks. Vanessa is also an associate with the Sustainability Science program at Harvard University, focused on innovation. One Earth is also co-leading a global campaign, Disruptive Imaginings, to create positive and compelling visions of life in sustainable futures. Welcome, Vanessa. Thank you. Greg Van Alstyne, Associate Professor at OCAD U, Co-Founding Director of Strategic Innovation Lab. Is it S-Lab? S-Lab, okay. Greg Van Alstyne is a designer, teacher, and futurist with 25 years in communications and experience design, visualization, branding, and strategic design. Greg is co-founding director of Strategic Innovation Lab, S-Lab, at OCAD U, where his research includes emergence and innovation ecosystems, futures of digital media, and design thinking. Among his current projects, Greg is a service director for Design Jam. Excuse me while I change pages. Oh no, the suspense is killing me. Okay, now I'm just going to wing it. And he's a great dancer. I'm just kidding. It's okay, I've got something else here. I'll just read him Annie's. Okay, super. And the co-investigator for digital governance, Shirk-funded. And prior to OCAD U, Greg led the Institute Without Boundaries, was a creative director at Icon Nicholson, New York, and founded the Department of New Media at the MoMA in New York. Thank you, Greg. Finally, Annie Wong, young mammals director of the Mammalian Diving Reflex. So the Mammalian Diving Reflex, you remember, did that terrific opening icebreaker this morning that was so amazing. Annie Wong is an artist, arts educator, and writer. Her work is conceptually diverse and is embedded in various practices as experimental pedagogy, endurance, and performance, and relational aesthetics. She is currently the Young Mammals Director of the Mammalian Diving Reflex and Broken Pencil Magazine's education coordinator, where she collaborates with young people to create socially engaged work. She holds a BA in English Literature and an MA in Communication and Culture from York University. Welcome, Annie. I was looking at what we were talking about today in terms of future of creativity and future of art and change-making art. And I found this great quote by writer Edith Wharton, who said, "There are two ways of spreading the light, to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it." And it made me think about how we can move forward, how we can sustain, how we can keep that candle burning, and how we can tease out change from people and give people agency. So a lot of the things that we talked about today in some of the breakout sessions was allowing people to tell their own stories and giving people the tools with which to do that. So what we'd like to talk about today is how art can inspire and empower young generations. There's been a lot of inspiring work that we've seen today and talked to a lot of interesting people today, we want to talk about how we can move forward and what the future holds in terms of sustainable changing, social change in art. The first theme that we're going to look at is how we look at and understand the future. How can people better imagine it? Vanessa, I'm going to start with you. So how can we, you're looking at building awareness and change around one of the largest, most complex problems that we have today, and that's climate change and strategy around sustainable futures. So how do you propose that we can look at a kind of cultural change required to address those kinds of issues?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Laurie, and hello, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for having me. You know, cultural change around climate change, you know, I think actually, Laurie, it's really about, for me, also about a cultural reframing about what we mean by climate change. So I was thinking if we could explore climate change and then how we're imagining these futures and what might be possible. So in terms of climate change itself, I have to say that typically we actually approach climate change as a technological or a scientific problem, which it is. And there might be another powerful framing, and I'm sure some of you in the room are already doing this, which is it's not just a technological and scientific problem, it's also a deeply cultural challenge. And I draw on Mike Hume, who wrote a great book called Why Do We Disagree About Climate Change? And he has this great way of putting it. He says, instead of thinking about humans solving climate change, what happens if we ask, how does climate change solve humans? And the reason I like that flipping is because it actually asks of us, what are the psychological, ethical, and spiritual work that happens when we start to engage with such a big and all-inclusive challenge like climate change? And he basically says, you know, that we have, you know, he says this, I love this, understanding the ways in which climate change connects with our foundational human instincts opens up possibilities for resituating culture and the human spirit at the heart of our understanding of our changing climate. And I learned about this from two of our colleagues from Disruptive Imaginings, John Robinson and David Maggs. And they've got a SHORC-funded project called Sustainability in an Imaginary World. And they're saying, you know, a lot of the times we're engaging with these challenges like climate change or sustainability, we think that it's about making the world more real. So we try and pull together all the scientific evidence and put it out in larger and bigger pamphlets and larger and bigger graphs and try and show to people, this is real, this is happening. And what they're posing the question is, instead of asking, is the challenge to make the world more real? What if we say, is the challenge to make the world more imaginary? And if we take that challenge, that climate change is an imagination challenge, how are we doing? So if we start from that reframing, let's ask, how are we imagining now? Well, I'm sure many of us have seen that much of the imagination around what's going on with climate change and what we perceive the future to be are often very dystopic images, right? They're kind of like climate hell, like where we might end up. But perhaps what our task is start to envision vibrant senses of kind of low carbon heaven. And I just last week went to see Tomorrowland from the Disney film. And in it, there's a big movie billboard for a fake movie called Toxicosmos 3, which is this like sci-fi film. Obviously, there's been two others. This is like a seriously dystopic film, the movie that's on the billboard. And in Tomorrowland, basically, there's a character in there called Nix, played by Laurie. And Nix thinks that the way to wake people up is you got to scare people to actually start to take change, make change happen. And he kind of sends them all the worst images ever. And what happens is people start gobbling them up, and they start creating more and more pop cultural dystopic futures. And one of the lead actresses in the film says, you know, drawing on the Cherokee story, you know, there are two wolves that are fighting. One is darkness and despair, and the other is lightness and hope. Which wolf wins? And then the answer is the one we feed. So her thing is, well, maybe we're feeding the wrong wolf. Like maybe what we need to be doing is actually getting a sense of what's possible. And Nick says to her, but dystopias are the way forward, because when we see dystopic futures, he says, It doesn't ask anything of us. And I don't know if that's right. Is that why we start getting really focused on dystopic futures? So ever since I was 15 years old, I had the sense that the environmental movement needed to tell the urgency of the story, but we were missing a lot of the other side of the story. You know, there's a lot of place for people who want to just hear the problems and get a push from the problem side, but what about the pull of the possible? And so my sense was that there was a real need to actually start painting pictures of what was possible. And so the last thing I want to talk about is not just how we've imagined in the past, which might have been predominantly been this kind of more negative perspective in terms of the pop culture mainstream view of the future, but what if we actually make the future not inevitable, but actually something that we can co-create? And why not think about not just one future, but multiple futures, possible futures? So I was very lucky to find people like Sean, who you heard this morning from Musigetti's. Ross is here from Adjacent Possibilities, who some of you met, and Scott, who were here earlier. Futurists, sustainability people, artists. And we've now formed a kind of collective learning space around the question or the hypothesis that creating an amazing set of imaginings of possible aspirational futures might actually, and exposing people and engaging people in a rich body of work that envisions these type of futures might be what will help us lead to better pathways forward. And you know, the things we're trying to address here are moving from doom and gloom towards more aspirational, moving from single futures to actually picturing multiple possible pathways, moving from like incremental change to actually step change, so the large changes we need, moving from thinking that the future is determined by experts to actually creating participatory structures for futures and co-creating it together. So 2 weeks ago, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So this is a network of city managers from Canada and the United States, 130 cities, Chicago, Toronto, Vancouver, Dallas, Texas, all on the phone around climate change. And they talked about what was going on in the different cities. And they were asked in a survey poll on the phone, what do you think is the biggest barrier to getting our action in cities on climate? And 85% of them said, we can't picture it. So I just want to end with one last thing, is that this isn't just about creating visions that happen out there. I'll just tell you a story that links to what we were talking about earlier around suburbs and urban areas, et cetera, et cetera. There's a wonderful woman named Ellen Dunham Jones, and she talks about something called retrofitting suburbia. And one of the stories she told, which just really stuck with me, is there was a city in the United States, which I've forgotten exactly where it was, but it was a town where the downtown core was kind of destitute, right? There wasn't really anything going on because everyone was going to the outlying shopping areas, like outside of town. We've seen this 100 times. So the community got kind of a bit sick of it. They were like, you know, our downtown is like nothing's going on. There's crickets, like nothing's going on. So they decided for 2 weeks to pretend that their downtown core was vibrant. And they made fake shops, and kids were making drawings on the street. There was music. There was collective potlucks. They created fake storefronts. Everyone like spoke about it as if this had all happened. And after 2 weeks, they didn't want it to end, so they created that downtown. So I think when we're talking about visualizing the future, I don't think we're just getting better at world visioning, but we become better at world making. And you know, I've learned a lot from the futures, but I'm learning more and more from Sean and others from Musigetti's about the incredible role that the artists can play, because we've always played that role in envisioning possibilities. And so Disruptive Imaginings, which is the name of that collective, is really about that. But I think there's a broader call here. You know, how do we make this cultural change around climate change? I think it's about reframing it as a cultural challenge, about how climate change can change us. It's about really exploring possible forms for imagining possible futures, and not just showing the dystopic side, but let's also look at what's possible. So that's, I think, what the big changes we need in these critical challenges.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That's such a hopeful message. Thank you. And a really great full circle from Judith's having us go halfway around, all the way around. You know, the idea that if we can imagine better, then we can do better. So Greg, continuing on that idea, how can art help us better imagine and understand the future as a designer and a futurist? Do you think there's a role for artists in coming up with disruptive imaginings for the future?
It's a tough question, but I have. So I'm going to talk about risk taking and risk management, and so to practice what I preach, by taking a risk, I'm going to say some things that I think are maybe questioning inherited ideas about art.
It's going to be a dust up here, folks.
I think the whole symposium is doing that, so I think it's doing what my aim is, in a way, to do what's happening here already. I'm riding the horse in the direction it's going, I hope. And in terms of risk management, I'm going to read from some notes, if you don't mind, a little bit. So my aim is to speak frankly and constructively and learn if these ideas resonate with or challenge the discussion here. And by the way, thanks to Cheryl, Nicole, Wendy, and everybody who invited me to contribute. I'm really thrilled to be here. So these views are my own and do not represent those of my employer, OCAD University. I thought I might mention that in terms of risk management. I'm here as a designer and a futurist. My work centers on research, teaching, professional practice in these fields. The panel asks, how might we look at and understand the future? And as Vanessa just outlined, and many of us did in the workshop she and her colleagues ran, there are answers, there are techniques, and I'm part of a community that teaches it at a graduate and undergrad level. So I work to answer this question every day in the lab, in the classroom, in the field, together with partners, users, participants, colleagues, and students. It's a very inclusive and participatory way to do it. And if you think of Alvin Toffler or somebody from the past, Marshall McLuhan, someone associated with this, it was like a lone guy in a room, like in a library. It's not like that in the 21st century, thank goodness. So I co-founded Strategic Innovation Lab, or SLab, as a platform for creating opportunities. And the opportunities we want to do, as Vanessa said, is about creating possible futures, envisioning possible futures, and also preferable ones. But we have to understand what might happen that we don't want to happen, how to mitigate against the ones that we don't want as well. And I'm a part of a graduate program. It's called the Masters of Design and Strategic Foresight and Innovation. Many of the students are here today, and it's the only one of its kind in Canada, one of few in the world, specifically overlapping design and art and futuring techniques to make change makers, people who have the courage and also the skills, the hard skills, to lead a new kind of innovation. So our approach in brief is problem finding, problem framing, and problem solving. It's not what design in the 20th century design was really problem solving, but this is design thinking. It's larger, it's much more inclusive of things like unintended consequences, and it's not a professional discipline alone, it's very horizontal. We employ techniques for looking at and understanding the futures, in plural, to make better decisions today. And we futurists have colorful methods for doing it. Things like horizon scanning, emerging issues analysis, scenarios, wild cards, black swans, wind tunneling, lots of exotic things, but they're all teachable and they're all inviting people to the table. So with stakeholders with a goal usually of maximizing diversity, or something Ashby, a systems thinker, called requisite variety, we work creatively and analytically. With great imagination, but also great rigor. We find and synthesize patterns of change, what Institute for the Future calls materials of the future. What are those things? Signals, trends, drivers, assumptions, uncertainties. Scenarios is a big one. It's kind of a cardinal technique. Risks, implications, and strategies. These are all the things that we work with. So here's one definition from Richard Slaughter, an Australian foresighter. Strategic foresight is the ability to create and sustain a variety of high-quality forward views and to apply the emerging insights in organizationally useful ways. So let's talk about art and design. How do art and design tie to the future? Well, pretty early on, we can say that understanding the future requires creativity. Why? Because it doesn't exist. It has to be created. It has to be created as a knowledge object to study ahead of time, and it has to be created in the real world too. I mean, we are making the future every day with big decisions and little decisions, like tearing down the gardener or not, or coming to work on time or not, and it's all those scales. It must be created to be studied, but also to be done. And Do artists have a unique, privileged role in this capacity? Here's where I'm turning the corner a little bit. In my view, no. Art is necessary, but it's not sufficient to strategic foresight work. In other words, art alone will not produce a variety of high-quality forward views that are organizationally useful. It's probably the last part that matters a lot. Like, it has to be instrumental, or it has to have handles on it, or it has to be user-centered, in my view. That is to say, I think design thinking is a better framework for working with foresight to get certain things done that can be defined ahead of time. And I don't think art is in the business of defining things, its objectives ahead of time. But sometimes we have to do that. So don't get me wrong, I love art, and I've been part of the art world, and I'm in that world. I'm not saying I'm not, but I'm trying to just sort of draw some distinctions that might be productive. So if we want to see art as useful to social innovation, which is purposive and intentional and has measurables and all that kind of stuff, let's challenge some ideas. Art, here's a few ideas I would like to challenge. Art as a product. No, that's very materialistic and static. Art as an activity. Too ephemeral, not big enough. Art as an industry. Too institutional, too economic. Doesn't fit. What do I sense from this symposium? Ezra Pound said, and later was quoted by Marshall McLuhan, artists are the antennae of the race. Interesting idea, but it sounds to me like artists are like a mutation, a DSM kind of category or something. McLuhan also recounts a story that the people from Bali, Indonesia, have a saying. It's apocryphal, I think, but he said it. We have no art. We do everything as well as we can. So art, in a way, can be a measure, a kind of excellence, as in state of the art. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's why we're here together to talk about that. Let's set aside these inherited ideas. Art is excellence. Art is product of uncommon sensitivity, that it's only rare and gifted individuals produce it, etc. If we want to tie art to social innovation, consider this idea. Art is a method. We might lose something by saying that, but it makes sense to me right now. Everyone can and should practice art. Same for design thinking, business thinking, and futures thinking, in my view. Creativity is innate. Sir Ken Robinson said, it's taught out of us. And when we look at kids and what happens as they grow older, we can see that. Like Edward de Bono, I think creative thinking is teachable. It's completely teachable. But what we're doing is getting it back. We're probably retrieving it. We're not pouring it into a vessel or something like that. Daniel Pink, Richard Florida, Roger Martin, lots of people are pointing out new demand and a rise of a new class to fill that demand. So something's going on, and that's, there's a lot going on here in the room, and this symposium was really well responded to. Artists are great at risk-taking. Yeah, absolutely, and we have to have that. But foresight, like design, requires risk management. Like the discussion that was happening earlier in the first panel today about responsibility, I think is relevant. It's true that artists bring imagination. Veteran futurist Jim Dater's second law states, any truly useful idea about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. So we need imagination, but why would we want to outsource or specialize that? So for me, foresight relies on something more difficult. I think the foresight profession understands that it's a balance of provocation and plausibility. So provocation is needed, but it has to be believable, and it actually can and should be based on evidence. Like, even though we're talking about the future, even though we're trying not to project linearly, because linear projections are always wrong, what we have to do is understand systems and nonlinearity and complexity and emergence and things like that. And imagination can get us to those places, but only informed by these other discourses, in my view. It's not just wildness in and of itself. It's a structured disciplinary thing, but it's also radically horizontal. It's transdisciplinary. So the reason is simple, that it needs that, and it needs everyone to bring that. Because foresight is concerned with the future of, well, everything. It's that sweeping a discipline. It's about the future of anything and everything. So it's radically inclusive and radically integrative. So design excels at sense-making, and art excels at strange-making. Foresight, I will argue, is committed to two kinds of making the strange familiar, and making the familiar strange. Pattern making, pattern breaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It reminds me of that notion that design offers the solution and art asks the question. And when you were talking about creativity being taught out of us, it reminded me of watching my two boys drawing, and my eldest son said about his younger brother's drawings, "I really like Leo's drawings because they're so imaginative." And I said, "Yours are imaginative too. He's a very talented artist." And he said, "Oh, I thought you were born with a lot of imagination and then you lose it as you grow up." I know, my heart kind of went. So that brings us to Annie. Annie, you work with the Mammalian diving reflex, and I understand that the young people who are here today were part of your first cohort of children. The haircuts by children, is that correct? No? Oh, okay.
Some of them, but not all.
Some of them. Well, I think that's very interesting that some of them were as well, because the idea of sustainable art and sustainability and some of the questions around storytelling in the breakout session today were, well, what do you do next once you get these people working in, you're starting to create change, what's the next step and how do you sustain that? And so I guess my question for you is where you see the role of art in shaping their future aspirations, values, and goals as you are working with young people.
So I found that question incredibly difficult to answer, and so it took me 2 days to come up with notes with an answer that I'm actually satisfied with. So, like Greg, I'm going to read from the notes that I very meticulously made. So, what is the role of art in the work that I do? And I find that that's only one agent in many involved in shaping their future aspirations and goals, because the training programs that I lead with Mammalian can be considered actually quite unartistic. They involve the grind of art production, such as administration, budgeting, logistics, and that kind of stuff. If anything, the role of art in my work has led many of them to set their aspirations and goals outside of the arts. They're not actually interested at all in becoming artists. Well, Young Mammals, that's the wing I lead, operates as a 10-year succession plan. When we work, where we work with youth, some of them that you saw here today, there are about 10 of them. They're called the Torontonians, and we worked with them since 2010. And our larger goal is to train them for 10 years. We're in our keystone year now, so we've been working with them for 5 years, to eventually assume positions and power the company. So in about 2020, we hope that they will take over the company. We don't know this. Young Mammals is an experiment in itself. That's kind of our ideal and our foresight, but whether we accomplish this or not, we have no idea. Right now, currently, out of the 10, only 2 have jobs in the arts, while many of them have demonstrated interest in psychology, in accounting, in life sciences. Life science, yes. But that's important for us. Like, they're entering their second year of university now. And that sort of diversity of interests for the youth is what's really important for us, because we're not interested in creating artists out of these kids. We're interested in having them develop transferable life skills that they can apply in other disciplines. But what is important for us is that we maintain the connection, so when they grow up and become accountants, business leaders, or gym teachers, or whatever they decide to do, we can still maintain that collaboration and imagine new art practices and new partnerships with whatever field they decide to go in. So at the same time, Sanjay Ratnan, who is the founder of the Torontonians and is unsure of his academic future, always jokingly says to me, if all else fails, he'll be, quote unquote, stuck with Mammalian. I actually find this quite endearing, because Mammalian operates as a type of fallback plan. if kind of like a family business does, where he can trust, if nothing else works for him, that we will be there. And that kind of security is incredibly rare, especially for youth. And again, the Torontonians are from Parkdale, if you don't know too much about our outreach. That kind of security is incredibly rare, especially for youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that is why we've continued and march on with our succession plan, even if only for one youth, Sanjay Ratnan. In addition to creating art training programs, I also work with youth to make art. And when we begin the process, seldom is the question, well, how can this art that we're going to make together change your life? Instead, we work collaboratively to answer a set of aesthetic questions pertaining to the project, treating their decisions and opinions as equally valuable and important as any other professional artist. So within that collaborative framework, my work is less interested in direct impact per se, but rather it twists that very question that you presented me today. Where does the role of art shape the future aspirations of young people? Instead, I like to ask, well, how can young people now shape the future of art? And so when we begin to ask this question, there's this, and reconfigure the power dynamics, we can that's where the impact and that's where the empowerment in our work is realized. And often the result of our process sometimes doesn't look like art at all. For example, as part of our residency at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we held a Dare Night event where people of all ages came to Walker Court to play 2 hours of I Dare You games, like I dare you to lick this person's armpit, which many people did. And actually, one person did. Another project titled What a Drag, which involved Parkdale teens giving tours of their contemporary art galleries as visitors were dragged along on an inflatable donut. There are some pictures. I sent you some pictures. Yes. Let's look at those pictures. They're really great. That's a Dare Night. And then can you show the next one? The next one? There's this great picture of this really arty guy being dragged around the floor on an inflatable donut while these teenagers were talking about Lisa Steele, I think. Or something. Anyways, it was really great. So both these projects, imagine that. Both of these projects engage both young people and adults as equal players in a game of reimagining different ways of experiencing the art museum. And in both instances, it's the youth who are the instigators of these experiences and who demand a new way of thinking about the role of art. And in this relationship, art doesn't necessarily teach the youth anything per se, but rather it's the youth that teach the adults new ways of experiencing art in our institutions.
Thank you, Annie. That's great. So Lynn, I have here, Lynn, you are a student at Cross That Out, graduate.
Cross that out.
Dropout from Ryerson University.
We're going to go dropout.
Yes.
Hiatus.
And a leader for environmental change. And I know you believe in civic engagement and the power of art and design. So do you see shifts in how young people see the power of creativity and social change?
Well, okay, let me preface this with the reason why I have my laptop here. I didn't realize we were allowed to bring up notes. So this is, and I'm saving on paper.
You haven't been in school for long enough.
I haven't, exactly. I dropped out. It's been a year. And again, this is a question that I found very difficult to answer. So I think things are changing. They're changing very quickly. But I strongly believe that the youth of today, we have all the resources to make change happen, right? It's understanding how this can manifest itself. That's where the difference, or that's where the focus should be, right, in how we do things. I mean, the work that we do here at the Bodhi Collective, we believe that social change, it really is at the intersection of provoking critical thought, sparking that call to action, and also understanding, how to make meaningful experiences, right? And this is where art and design can come into play, right? And the art can change. I mean, this installation, I think that's a true testament to this notion, right? So again, the Bodhi Collective, we collaborated with Madeline Co. On this piece. And for those of you who had an opportunity to participate, reading some of those tags, I mean, so many of them really resonated with this idea, right? And one of them really struck a chord with me is it read, art can change nothing, but it's a consolation, right? And I think there's so much power in just living and sitting in this kind of frustration or this kind of doubt. And I think there's so much power to that. And I mean, this is a common and shared sentiment, I think, for a lot of those that are in Generation Y. I mean, by a show of hands, who falls under the millennial age gap? Yeah, a lot of you. Okay, same here, same with me. For those that had their arms raised, and this is a new term that I found, I guess, the other day, but can anyone define what nomophobiacs mean? Nomophobiacs. It's no, almost. So it's the fear of losing your cell phone or a fear of not having it on you, right? And I think this is something that I think a lot of losing your phone, being without your phone. And exactly. And that was the kind of response I had it was wow. But this is so real. And I think this is something that a lot of us can really relate to, right? I mean, we're told all the time that we're the generation of, narcissists, or that we're unhappy all the time, and perhaps it's true. Perhaps we're too dependent on the internet, or perhaps we're too hyper-connected. But the way that we approach this, I think, is our next step, right? It's how we can reflect on the current culture and how we can take the next step in more meaningful ways, in more of a dynamic way. Sorry, I just put together these notes about an hour ago with Laurie beside me, so I apologize for reading off my screen. So the one thing that we've been told, again, as students, as these new faces in the field of design, is understanding how to think more and design less, right? And again, this is one of the reasons why we started this collective. I mean, I come from a background in communications. I went back to school for economics. And our collective is made up of so many different disciplines. We have representation from science, psychology, journalism, new media, digital media, as well as architectural science and interior design, right? And this is the future. This is the future of art. This is the future of design. And this is how art, this is something that I hold very, very close to my heart, is how art can make social change sexy again, right? How youth engagement can be exciting. I ran in the provincial elections last year, and I laugh because it was the most terrifying experience of my life. And I was too afraid to let my age show, right? I was running against candidates that were a good 20, 30 years my senior, and it was a challenge. And again, I knew I wanted to do it again, and I am doing it again. So I'm running in this year's federal election. But again, we've developed a team of real young change makers, and I think this is where it starts, right? It's understanding how students and young minds can be trusted as leaders, and how we can be trusted as learners, right? Once that social narrative changes, that's where we start to see a lot of sustainable impact.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, I've got a question for.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Oh, I got the sign.
I know.
She had
Sorry,
the sign.
She had a sign.
She had the sign, but there's more talking to come. Don't worry. Okay, so this is a question for all of you. I'm hoping that you guys can all answer this. So how can Canada be best positioned in order to cultivate creativity and the arts in a way that is sustainable and impactful for the long term? So this is sort of all of those questions combined. How do we carry that candle? How do we keep that light going? I can open it up to all of you. Do either of you or any of you want to take charge with that? Canada.
Yeah. So I just want to say that I think that the key is to engage people where they are with the arts, and really to make the link between the arts and the complex challenges that we have. So really to embed that. And I think just another key thing that I think we can support in much more rich ways is the notion of improvisation. I've been very inspired with Musageti's engagement around that and the work I've done in improv. I think there's some really kind of interesting kernels for how we might co-create futures together in the field of improvisation. So those are two things I think, connect the artists into how we're thinking about these broader issues and improvisation.
And just to add, I posed that question to some of the youth I worked with, and I just want to share with you what they said. And it's kind of insightful. Chosen and Isabel, they're both 19 years old. And they said, Annie, what Canada needs to do is spread the oil money that's generating in Alberta to the arts. And that's really interesting because it just shows that young people are able to think cross-sectionally. And I think just to echo what Judith Marcuse mentioned earlier, talked about earlier, that's so important and that we engage cross-sectional partnerships and to imagine new practices in that light.
Me? Great, thank you. Just to echo what you were just saying, Annie, I think that kind of progressive and sustainable change, once we start to see, I guess, a greater investment in human and social and creative capital, once we start to see that shift and start to trust ourselves, again, as leaders, that's where we start to see a more collective action happening. And I think we're starting to see that shift now.
Some of the metrics, if we want to use that word, almost a dirty word, for Canada are not so good, and some of them are great. Like our diversity in the urban centers is amazing. It's a resource. We know that, and I think we're still learning how to really take advantage or enable it, turn it into what it already is becoming something, one of the coolest things about this country. And on the other hand, we get a D report card from the Conference Board of Canada on innovation every year or something like. We're known to be less entrepreneurial than south of the border, maybe for good reasons, like we survived the banking crisis because we were more conservative in the banking sector, et cetera. So there are particular dynamics and cultural things here that are definitely worth kind of looking at, and critically, like for better or worse. I'm excited to be here. I lived in the States for 8 years in New York, and I'm part of a reverse brain drain. I came back, and I'm thrilled to have come back. But and I think the Toronto is the best place to be in right now. It's just incredibly exciting. But there's a lot of work to be done, and things like reparation around First Nations issues. That we're not going to feel good about the whole place until we start to make real work on those fronts across the board. There's a lot of work to be done.
And where do you suggest that we begin? Where do you see that happening?
Well, the kind of collectivism that's represented in a lot of the photos that we're showing earlier show lots of people in the room. I think that's one way to start. So if everyone is, and there's some, we're not just talking about whatever. It's probably in our case, and I perhaps assume in some of the others, there's a highly facilitated discussion like the workshop that we were part of earlier. And out of that comes a respectful sharing of views and a finding of a common vision. And there might even be a sort of speaking truth to power. Like there's a lot of permission giving. And that's the best thing. One of the best things about art, not just courage and risk taking, is the permissiveness of the whole field. Because it's an open system, you can it's whatever you can get away with. I'm not sure who made that definition, but I like it. Art is whatever you can get away with, and activism in a way is sort of the same. So there's potential in all of those, like conflating those things to have activist art, activist social work. And combining all these things is the right way to start.
Do any of you want to add to that? No? Okay, I think maybe we'll open it up to questions then. That was wonderful. I'd like to thank you all very much. That was a wonderful panel. Has anyone got any questions for our panelists?
That's good.
How might we live our lives in a way that imagining alternate futures impacts us day to day? And how is that something that you personally have been able to integrate into the way you approach the world and your own work?
So, I think one of the things, I loved what Greg was saying about foresight and that intersection between foresight and the arts. But I think oftentimes we've given futures over even to the foresight specialty. And one thing that we could do to make it a part of everyday lives is, just like we learn history in schools, to start exploring futures as part of the way. It's a major skill we have as a human being. And the other thing I think we can do is really to make the future now, right? So rather than having it be something that we see us creating in the future, but really start populating our cities with how we want to start evolving it. So, Candy Chang does that in New York, where you start saying, I wish this was, and you post it on the thing. I think there's ways in which we can start to populate our cities, start to explore what could be possible here. So Adam Kahane, who's a future scenario planner, he was saying that the difference between the old futures was really about what will be. So I was saying this to Steve from the Center for Artistic Activism earlier. It's a difference between what will be, which is a projection from today, what should be, which is kind of like a nagging thing, like, oh, we should do this. And Adam's saying when we ask the question, what could be, we start cracking things open. So I really think that that's where I think the potential is of every day saying, what could be here? What could we do?
If that's opening up sort of possible futures, like exploratory, the preferred is there's some power in asking how might we, and even just the word who is, even we, like who is we, is a question I've asked in groups, and it's an interesting question because you're starting to ask, well, who's self-identifying with the group that we seem to be in? What is the name of that group? Did we make up that name? Is it the right name? Or should we have a tag cloud? Like, should we be walking around like a tag cloud? Because there's a lot of labels connected to the thing. And so constituting yourself as part of a community, which we all do in different ways, and being more conscious about that and deciding being conscious about where you're putting your energy, whose agenda you might be serving, whether you're aware, highly aware of it, or partly aware, being honest with yourself. Like basically, I guess what our graduate program in some ways enables some people to do a self-transformation, because that's the stage they're at. Others, they're able to kind of transform their community, or they want to change the world. And there's some of them are probably on a pretty good path to being able to do that at some level. And if we all imagine that kind of Russian doll or something, the ability, or the fractal, the ability to, in fact, the responsibility to do self-transformation in order to do change-making. I'm not admitting that I've done all of those things. I mean, I'm a learner too. I'm in a school as a teacher because teaching is a great way to learn.
That reminds me of the art in front of the gentleman's house who then started making change himself. If we feel like we're included in the sentiment, if we feel like we are part of it, then we have agency, we have empowerment, and we have responsibility as well. I think there was another question. Okay.
Hello. Oh, God. Okay. I guess I was thinking about futurism as like, anyways. I was thinking about Louis Real and his famous statement of, people will sleep for 100 years, and when they wake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back. And I wonder if there's something in terms of looking back in order to look forward. I don't know. Can you speak to that? I love what you've said. So, I mean, how does looking back help us look forward?
Well, if we talk about we can talk about foresight. We can also talk about insight, which a lot of us are good at. Artists are good at. A lot of people, like anyone who's human-centered, I think, has a good handle on insight gathering and insight identification. And in a way, history can be thought of as hindsight. And obviously, when we say hindsight is 20/20. It becomes another visual metaphor. So it's good to draw across those, and so you can do, for example, an era analysis and see large swaths of time that sort of acquire a certain image of a certain period. Like if I say the Victorian era, a whole lot of associations flood. And so as a futurist, one of the things we do is enable the building of a possible future era and what might come to stand for that era, maybe for better, maybe for worse. Or we could do it about the present, like the thing you were talking about, millennials and their phones and fear of losing the phone. That, in a way, is an icon of values in our era. So thinking about, and also cultivating a longer-term time frame, like the Long Now Foundation, they add another 0 at the front of the year, so it's like 02015. It's 2015 right now. It's not 2015. It's 2015 to avoid the sort of mega millennial bug. Because then 10,000 years from now, we won't think, oh, geez, we should have added another zero. It's obviously it's a rhetorical move, but that's the kind of playful and yet meaningful crossing of futures thinking and creative thinking that I think the whole event is about.
Anyone else?
Everyone's tired.
Thank you
see it.
again very much, everyone. That was great.